Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Aztlantes podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Aztlantes. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano Tlakatekatl.
So this is part 2, the second half of a 2-part episode. If you have not listened to part 1, I encourage you to go back one episode and fill yourself in on all the juicy tidbits relating to the origins of La Virgen de Guadalupe so that you are up on the current discussion. When we left off, we ended with the establishment of a shrine in honor of Cortez's beloved Virgen de Guadalupe, which was built at Tepeyac or Tepeyacac near Mexico City. So now, dear listeners, we continue with our story of the Immaculate Deception. The shrine at Tepeyac attracted a small but loyal following. This led Fray Diego de Santa to request that it be renamed, since
the Guadalupe of Tepeyac was making people forget the Guadalupe of Extremadura, and that many who contributed to the ermita believed that their money was going to Spain. This is from Pool 2004.
So it was a little bit of confusion, right? They were donating money to La Virgen de Guadalupe, the shrine at Tepeyac, but they thought that the money that they were giving to that shrine was going to Spain.
So there was a little bit of double dealing going on? Is that what I get from this?
It seems like it, because it's two different entities, mm-hmm. right? And the people in Spain wanted that money.
So wait, so who was getting the money?
You know what? Now I'm unclear.
First you get the money. Then you get the power. And then you get the Virgen, I guess. I don't know. Is that how it goes?
As Catholicism spread, several community-based cults sprang up throughout Mexico. Each was centered around the veneration of a different Catholic figure. Guadalupe's small following among Spanish and indigenous communities was a relatively local phenomenon. Sometime around 1556, a new painting of La Virgen was placed inside the shrine at Tepeyac. It is this image that we most closely identify with La Virgen de Guadalupe of Mexico today. While the authorship of this image is unclear, it is generally accepted to be the work of indigenous artist Marcos Zipac de Aquino. In a now controversial sermon delivered September 8, 1556, Fray Francisco de Bustamante mentioned that the image hanging in the shrine had recently been painted by an Indian and was detrimental to the
Indian neophytes already confused between adoring what was on the altar made of, quote, cloth, paint, or wood, end quote, and the true Mother of God who is in heaven.
In 1648, the Criollo priest, Father Miguel Sanchez, hoped to popularize the shrine at Tepeyac by writing a book titled The Image of the Virgin Mary. It was in this book that the modern myth of La Virgen was born. Sanchez wrote the book hoping to attract more followers to the temple at Tepeyac and to establish Guadalupe as the primary Virgin Mary in New Spain, in an effort to overshadow the Virgen de los Remedios, which was favored by most of the Spaniards who had been born in Spain. So we're seeing this division now between the Criollos and the Peninsulares. According to Sanchez's story, on December 9th, 1531, the Virgin Mary appeared to a recently Christianized Nawa by the name of Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac. Juan Diego reported his encounter to the Catholic Archbishop Zumarraga, who at first did not believe him. Once again, Mary appeared to Juan Diego, and once again, Archbishop Zumarraga did not believe him. A few days later, on December 12th, 1531, Mary appeared once more and caused flowers to grow on the barren hill. She then told Juan Diego to gather up the flowers in his tilma, a long cloak made of cactus fiber, and take the flowers to the archbishop as proof of her appearance.
3 times the charm.
Yep. When Juan Diego unfolded his tilma in front of the bishop to let the flowers fall out, it was revealed that Mary had left an image of herself embedded on the tilma. This quote-unquote miracle tilma, made of simple maguey fiber and bearing the image of La Virgen, is allegedly the same tilma that hangs in the temple at Tepeyac today, which is now known as La Basilica de Guadalupe. With the publication of Sanchez's book, Marcos Sipac de Aquino's modest painting was transformed into a sacred object through literary invention, an immaculate deception, if you will. And I will. The painting of Guadalupe, created by Marcos Sipac de Aquino, bears little resemblance to the Guadalupe figure that sits in Extremadura, Spain. Aquino's tilma at Tepeyac appears to be a hybrid image, combining 2 popular Marian themes: the woman of the apocalypse, as described in Revelation 12:1, where she is
a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars.
And common depictions of the Assumption of the Virgin. A comparison of the famous tilma image to Marian depictions, which were widely available at the time, strongly suggests that they served as a visual basis or inspiration for the tilma image. Of particular note is the Virgen del Coro, which hangs in the monastery of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Extremadura, and which was created in 1499. Marcos Sipac de Aquino had plenty of images available as inspiration for his famous painting. The site of Tepeyac was most likely selected because it had been the location of ceremonies venerating the female deity figures, or teteoh, known as Chicomecoatl, or Seven Serpent, and Sihuacoatl, the Serpent Woman. By placing a shrine in honor of La Virgen de Guadalupe at Tepeyac, the Spaniards hoped to subvert an indigenous sacred space and transform it into one of Catholic obedience. Every September 8th, a feast day was held in honor of the Virgen de Guadalupe, as was the practice in Spain. However, the task of supplanting an indigenous sacred site for a Catholic one proved more difficult than they had hoped, as ceremonies in honor of the Nawa mother deities persisted at this location. In the Florentine Codex, Sahagún expressed his frustration at the indigenous preference to recognize the shrine of Guadalupe as the location of Tonantzin. Tonantzin means our beloved mother, and it's a common title associated with various traditional Nawa mother deities. Sahagún argued that this confusion of La Virgen with Tonantzin was
something that should be remedied for the correct native name of Mother God. Holy Mary is not Tonantzin, but rather Dios Inantzin.
This literally means the mother of God in Nahuatl. He continues,
it appears to be a satanic invention to cloak idolatry under the confusion of this name, Tonantzin. And they now come to visit from very far away as before, which is also suspicious, because everywhere there are many churches of Our Lady, and they do not go to them. They come from distant lands to this Tonantzin, as in olden times.
So, as a quick aside, I think it's important to note that Tonantzin, the way most people in danza use it, is sort of incorrect, because Tonantzin is a title. It's not the name of an individual teteoh, right? There was Tonantzin, and then, our beloved mother, the title, and then the name of the actual teteoh. And there were multiple teteoh, these
right.
female.
I think the one that most people associate with Tonantzin is Coatlicue.
Yeah, so Tonantzin Coatlicue, which is funny because at Tepeyac, it wasn't Tonantzin Coatlicue that was venerated. It was the two other Tonantzin figures, Chicomecoatl and Sihuacoatl, that were venerated.
So how does Coatlicue get inserted into the narrative that we're going to get into, this idea of Tonantzin being equal to the Virgen de Guadalupe? How does that occur?
That's a good question, and I've done a lot of research. I haven't found the exact moment where people started referencing or connecting Tonantzin with Coatlicue specifically. I suspect it has something to do with the MCRCA, but I'm not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous participation at the Guadalupe Shrine was not driven by faith in her image, but rather the desire to continue venerating the ancestral mother figures of Chicomecoatl and Sihuacoatl, both of whom held the title of Tonantzin. It is also clear that the Spaniards were struggling with how to resolve this issue of perceived satanic idolatry. After all, indigenous patrons to the shrine had little interest in La Virgen de Guadalupe. As Jeanette Peterson notes,
aside from her association with traditionally sacred space, her female gender, and her reputed powers over natural forces, the Mexican Guadalupe was an eminently European image that had little meaning for the native worshiper.
Eventually, the official feast day of La Virgen de Guadalupe was changed from September 8th to December 12th, the day that she allegedly appeared to Juan Diego. It is unknown exactly when this took place, but the effort to distance the Guadalupe of Mexico from the Guadalupe of Spain was no accident. Indigenous critics have long decried the Mexican Guadalupe as a tool invented by the Spanish to indoctrinate indigenous people under the guise of Tonantzin. But as I have demonstrated, this isn't exactly the case. Mexico's indigenous people felt no special relationship to Guadalupe beyond her place as one of several Catholic images brought from Spain. In fact, the motivation behind the invention of a distinct Mexican version of Guadalupe is far more mundane. It was all about the money.
Lebowski.
The Virgin's association with the image in Extremadura meant that the majority of donations collected at the Tepeyac Shrine were diverted to the monastery in Spain. The Criollo plan was simple. Craft a new image of the Virgin that was visually distinct from the Guadalupe statue in Extremadura, establish a new feast day in her honor, and create an origin story that reframes her as an American apparition. By disconnecting the Mexican version from her Spanish roots, the Criollos could claim her image as an independent event. As a result, all of the alms collected at her shrine in Tepeyac would remain in Criollo hands. She was transformed from a source of Spanish economic control into a symbol of Criollo identity and independence.
And I think that's what we were talking about when we left off in the previous episode,
Yes.
part 1 of this. Now,
Yeah.
before we continue, I wanted to just signpost here something here that we can circle back to, and I hope we don't forget to come back to it, is this idea, because I think you also kind of emphasized it, of December 12th being the date set for the supposed apparition. Now, do you know exactly why that date was chosen? Because I have an idea, and I think I've mentioned it before in the past. I don't know if I've ever actually written anything on that, but my interpretation of December 12th is that it has something to do with like the novenas, and how the novenas in Mexico, the 9 days are done in honor of the Virgen. And wasn't that part of the ceremony that was conducted to honor and celebrate the birth of the sun for the winter solstice and Huitzilopochtli? Wasn't that previously associated with Huitzilopochtli, and then it sort of gets transposed when that celebration gets shifted to the Virgin to December 12th, and those 9 days of celebration leading up to the winter solstice get sort of supplanted to celebrate the Virgin. I mean, that was my understanding. I just didn't know if maybe you had a different interpretation of that.
No, I think you're onto something, because the one thing we have to remember is at the time that all of this was happening, they were using a different calendar, right? So if we look at what was going on December 12th, back before the Gregorian reform, it coincides basically with the winter solstice. Mm-hmm. So I think it was all tied into that. Excellent observation there,
Why, thank you, sir.
Dr. Arellano. La Criolla rises. The image of La Virgen de Guadalupe, preserved in the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, depicts a woman standing atop a crescent moon being supported by a small angel, her blue mantle covered with golden stars. She has a small black band tied around her waist, a common indication of pregnancy. The image is a graphic representation that Christ is to be born again among the peoples of the New World. And it's a message as relevant to the New World today as it was during the lifetime of Juan Diego. As years passed, tensions continued to grow between the Spaniards born in Spain, Peninsulares, or the more pejorative Gachupines, and the ethnic Spaniards who had been born in Mexico, known as Criollos. The Criollos established an identity for themselves as the true chosen people of the New World and pointed to the quote-unquote miraculous appearance of La Virgen de Guadalupe, as described in Father Miguel Sanchez's book, as evidence of their preferred status. The Criollos referred to La Virgen as La Criolla and saw her alleged appearance in Mexico as proof that they were the chosen people of the New Jerusalem. After all, according to Stafford Poole, she was born a second time, not in Judea, but in New Spain, her new homeland, whose people were specially favored by her. The Virgin of Guadalupe became a symbol of Criollo divine providence, since
The Virgin's apocalyptic icon... Damn it. The Virgin's apocalyptic iconography embodied all the components of the Creole program to verify the miraculous apparitions of Guadalupe as an American phenomenon, to justify the conquest, and to glorify Mexico.
in the eyes of the Criollos, La Virgen de Guadalupe was the perfect nationalistic symbol. Despite their European heritage, the criollos felt as though they were being treated as second-class citizens by the quote-unquote pure Spaniards. Fray Juan de Villa brought this view to the forefront in a sermon delivered on December 26, 1733, when he declared that, as God gave Moses the law on the mountain, so he gave Zumarraga the image on a hill. The tensions came to a head on September 16, 1810, when a criollo priest named Miguel Hidalgo de Castillo rallied his fellow criollos in a struggle for independence from Spain with his famous Grito de Dolores, a call to arms that ended with the words,
"Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe! Death to bad government! Death to the Gachupines!"
Well, I can agree with Hidalgo on that one. Yeah. That last part, anyway.
The last part.
Ultimately, La Virgen de Guadalupe was effectively made into a utopic vision for the evangelization and colonization of the Americas, as a way to defeat paganism, to realize a new Jerusalem, and ultimately to endorse the formation of a Mexican nation. It was Father Hidalgo's grito that transformed La Virgen into a national patroness. Her image emblazoned across banners and flags during the War for Independence as a symbol of criollo resistance to Spain. Following the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, a wave of nationalism based on the exaltation of Mexico's indigenous past swept across the nation. It was during this time that the image of La Virgen de Guadalupe was reinvented as a symbol of indigenous pride. Reproductions of her image were often darkened to signify her position as indigenous patroness. Efforts were made to conflate the image of Guadalupe with those of Nawa mother deities, a misguided practice that continues to this day. Some of her more ardent followers even crafted an addendum to her origin story, claiming that she originally spoke to Juan Diego in the Nahuatl language. In this updated version of events, she refers to herself as Coatlashopeo and a few other made-up words that don't make any sense. Oh,
wait, is that how you pronounce it? I've always wondered how you pronounce that. I've always pronounced it Guatlashipu.
A word that allegedly translates as "she who crushed the serpent's head," which in turn was misunderstood by Spanish priests who mistook the name for their beloved Guadalupe of Extremadura. So basically she allegedly appears and she calls herself Coatlashopeo, and the Spaniards are like, oh, that sounds sort of like Guadalupe, but of course this is all...
Aren't there other names that she's been given that are supposed to be Nahuatl names?
Yeah, there's a few. Kind of like there's like two or three. This attempt at reframing the myth rings hollow, as the word Coatlashopeo and the other names that you'd mentioned does not translate to an actual word, nor does it follow any basic rules of Nahuatl grammar. Essentially, the word is a nonsensical invention. All of the alleged Nahuatl names that she had for herself are just, they don't work. They're not real Nahuatl words and they don't mean anything. I think...
And how do we know this?
Well, because of our good friend, Magnus Farrow Hansen.
Shout
out to Magnus, a Nahuatl speaker, PhD in linguistics, gave me the lowdown on what all of those, the etymologies of those words and how they just don't translate to anything.
Excellent.
Millennialism triumphant. Today, La Virgen de Guadalupe stands as one of Mexico's most recognizable national symbols, rivaling the Mexican flag itself in terms of popularity. Her image is found emblazoned on votive candles, rosaries, t-shirts, murals, and all other manner of religious and secular art. Every year on December 12th, the day of the Virgin's alleged appearance to Juan Diego, thousands of Mexican faithful flock to the Basilica at Tepeyac to venerate her image and pray for the Virgin to intercede on their behalf.
You forgot to mention tattoos, dude. I mean,
Yeah.
Who's the most famous Chicano who's got is maybe not. I was going to say.
Well, Johnny Tapia
Trejo.
definitely had La Virgen.
That's right.
La Virgen tattoo on him. So
That's right. Yep.
Good catch. Yeah, definitely a lot of tattoos. In 1996, and I remember when this happened, Monsignor Guillermo Schulenberg Prado, the abbot of the Basilica, was forced to resign after publicly doubting the historical veracity of the Virgin's appearance to Juan Diego.
Is that when you broke down in tears?
Yeah, I was like, it's still real to me. No, that's not what happened. I was like, I knew it. Despite numerous analyses of the tilma, all showing that the miraculous story of the image is nothing more than an elaborate hoax, Pope John Paul II canonized Juan Diego as a saint on July 31st, 2002. I also remember when that happened.
Yeah.
I was like, you're wrong.
You know what's funny about that, just as an aside, and it's inconsequential because I don't care one way or the other, but I think it's interesting when people say that, I think, what's her name? The Native American saint that was canonized a few years back.
That she was the first.
That she was the first. Kateri, I think, is one of her names. She has like two names. And I'm like, wait, wasn't Juan Diego canonized before she was? Is he not Native American?
I think now they amend it and say North American. Yeah, now when I see it mentioned, they amend it and actually say she was the first
isn't Mexico
North America. That's one of the things
that bugs me too, right? Because isn't
America.
Mexico part of North America? And so there's always this distinction being made between Anglophone America as being strictly North America, and anything that is Hispanophone America is by definition South America or Central South America, right? And like, well, I mean, I don't really care in terms of the religious aspect of it, but it bugs me with the other stuff too that relates to, indigenous cultures. Like there's always that, like somehow magically the border cuts off both, sides because of European language.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Anywho. That's my rant.
La Virgen de Guadalupe and the story of her appearance to Juan Diego at Tepeyac remain firmly entrenched in the collective Mexican and Mexican-American identity. One could say that the influence of Joaquim of Fior continues to radiate throughout the Mexican countryside and Chicano barrios of the United States. She remains an immaculate deception, brought to Mexico by Spanish invaders and forcefully grafted onto the Mexican psyche by Criollo nationalists.
You're just mean, Kurly.
And I'd meant to include this in the script, but I just didn't have time to really flesh it out. But I did want to mention that, so the whole Criollo idea was, we need to separate La Virgen de Guadalupe, like the Mexican version, from the Spanish version so we could keep the money, right? And it was basically the brainchild of these, they call them the four evangelists. And this includes Miguel Sanchez, who wrote the book, Luis Becerra Tanco, Francisco de Florencia, and Luis Lasso de la Vega. These four Spanish priests, Criollo priests, were the ones who were like, we need to establish her as separate. So what they did was, their plan was to invent a tradition, right? So make her visually distinct, redesign her image, and invent a tradition of her appearing in Mexico, not being brought from Spain by Cortez, but actually appearing here. And if we can establish her as a local tradition, we'll be able to keep all the money. And as part of this is they put together, so Miguel Sanchez's book was 1648. In 1666, these four men, the four evangelists, put together a special hearing, like a court case, basically, where they were going to establish that Mexico's Virgen de Guadalupe was different from Spain's Virgen de Guadalupe. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing. And if people want to know more about it, there's a great book written by Stafford Poole where he goes into, everything that happened during this event. And basically what they did is they hand selected their witnesses, right? And they wrote up questionnaires. And basically, they were going to hold this event where they asked Nawa people, like, you heard about this event back in the day, right? Like, you heard of Juan Diego, and this isn't new. This because the first appearance of any of this story was in Miguel Sanchez's book in 1648. So their idea was to get enough people together to basically swear that, oh, no, this is older than 1648. This happened a long time ago. Like, we heard about it when it happened. And it's funny because they basically handpicked their witnesses. And if you read their testimonies, each one is like, oh, yeah, I remember this. I was really young, and my great-grandparents knew Juan Diego. They hung out with him. And, we were... My grandma was at his wedding and this and that. And then the next guy will give their testimony and they're like, yeah, my grandparents knew Juan Diego. He died a virgin. He was so devout and he never knew a woman. And so each of their testimonies are different, which is pretty hilarious.
So wait, where did they find these people?
I mean, they basically, so this was 1666. People were already, going to the church, and the priests, Miguel Sanchez's book came out 1648, and they started convincing Nawa people, like, no, La Virgen de Guadalupe, the story of Juan Diego, like, this is real. So they basically found really devout people they were
retrofitting the narrative.
Exactly.
This term isn't very popular like it used to be, but this has been referred to as upstreaming. You sort of take something... Yeah. You apply it to the past when it's something that belongs in the present.
Yeah, so they created this tradition and then, retroactively put it into the past and pretended like...
Applied narratives from the present to justify the story as having actually occurred. But those people probably didn't even know Juan Diego if that person ever existed to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. So... in Stafford Poole's book, the book is called Our Lady of Guadalupe, The Origins and Sources of a Mexican National Symbol. He really goes into this 1666 inquiry, is what it's called. And he gives the lowdown.
Did you say 1666?
Dun, dun, dun.
Coincidence?
So in that book, he provides all the context for the inquiry, and he examines all the testimonies given by the 20 witnesses. And the testimony also included all the priests that I mentioned. So they gave their testimonies of like, oh no, Miguel Sanchez didn't make it up. This really happened,
the story that I want to know, because we know the story, the supposed apparition of the Virgin Mary to Juan Diego, etc. And people believe it, and they have, I have family and relatives that, they still believe this stuff, and more power to them. That's their business. That's their prerogative. But the story that I want to know is the story of Marcos Zipac de Aquino. What's his story?
Right?
Do we know his story? Like, what's going on with this guy that he gets chosen to be essentially the artist that's going to paint the image that will become the symbol of not only Criollo nationalism, but eventually of the Mexican nation. Next to the Mexican flag, the Virgen de Guadalupe is essentially the symbol of Mexico.
Yeah. All we really know about him is he was a Tlaquilo, and he had been trained in the European style. So as part of his... converting him to Catholicism, is they found this guy who was a really good painter, and it was trained in the indigenous tradition of painting. So they retrained him in the European tradition. I don't know why they picked him. Maybe he was the most talented of the former Tlaquilos. That could be something. But yeah, man, I would like to know more about him.
Right? Like what is his backstory? Like, how does he even get to the point where he is part of a group that is being selected to see who will paint this image to begin with? Like, I wonder, there's got to be something on him somewhere. Have you ever encountered anything that goes into deeper details about his background, his history?
Not in depth, no. Not beyond what I just told you.
Yeah. That sounds like a deep dive into... do we even know if Zipac Aquino even existed? Is he also a made-up person?
Well, he's referenced a lot. Like, his existence is referenced a lot in early Mexican colonial history. So they're pretty sure that he actually existed.
Okay. So there are sources that document the existence of a Marcos Zipac de Aquino, and there are sources that connect that individual with having been chosen to a committee that will paint this image, right?
Yeah, and a lot of those sources come from the priests who were pissed off that this was happening. They were like, wait, hold on a minute. We have a real Virgen de Guadalupe. Why is this Indian painting a fake one? And
so the priests that were assigned to the other churches who were losing money to this new chapel of the Virgen are the ones that begin to document the existence of the people behind the scam, is what you're telling me?
Yeah. They were like, what's going on here? You guys are trying to pull a fast one. And it's funny because this whole 1666 inquiry, they compile all of this phony evidence, and it was the validity of the Guadalupe tradition in Mexico. That was a foregone conclusion, right? This inquiry was just a formality. They were getting together. They already knew what the inquiry was going to find out. It was going to find out that their claims were real, that La Virgen de Guadalupe did appear to Juan Diego. So they compiled all of their evidence and they send it to Rome, and the church just sees right through it for what it is. And they're like, nah, we're good. Just keep sending the checks.
Suckers.
Yeah. Nice try, fellas. But one of the other things that they do in the inquiry is they rely on some writing by Ixtlilxochitl, right? Fernando Alva de Ixtlilxochitl. And they're like, Ixtlilxochitl makes reference to La Virgen de Guadalupe. So that's proof that the Nahuas knew about her before Miguel Sanchez wrote. But if you read what Ixtlilxochitl actually wrote, the four quotes that they pull from Ixtlilxochitl that actually do mention La Virgen de Guadalupe, it's clear he's talking about the modern myth of La Virgen de Guadalupe. He's not talking about, this event that he's not justifying or confirming the story of Juan Diego. He's just talking about, for example, one of the quotes that they use is, this is coming from a relación written by Ixtlilxochitl. He writes, Netzahualcoyotl, along with his warriors, attacked Mexico Tenochtitlan and entered by way of Tepeyacac, where Our Lady of Guadalupe is now. So they use this as proof. They're like, he's writing about ancient Mexican history.
And so when is he writing this?
I have it written down here somewhere.
Well, I'm looking at the date for the Nican Mopoa, or the Way Tlama Huizoltica. And apparently that one was published 1649, so a year after the original 1648 by what's the name? Lasso de la Vega, right?
Miguel Sanchez's homie.
But there's conflicting dates here, because some dates place even de la Vega's version as being published in 1649, which is a date that is supposed to be the same date that the Nican Mopoa was also published. Miguel Sanchez was writing in 1648. So yeah, I mean, basically 1648, 1649, all of these get published around that same time. And some people have claimed, as you were saying, that the Nican Mapoa was the first one, and then it was translated into Spanish, and that therefore, because it was originally done in Nahuatl, then that lends credence to this being an actual story that was handed down through the oral tradition and eventually written down. And by oral tradition, meaning just like one generation removed, because if it happened in 1531, and we're talking 1649, so it's within living memory of people that had been recently converted to Catholicism.
Yeah, and those are the where they drew from their witnesses,
their supposed witnesses, right? I don't know. Yeah, there's too many variables here. There's too many missing links. There's too many questions that have not been properly addressed. I don't know. Yeah, it's doubtful that this story actually happened because isn't it the case that Zumárraga himself, the main archbishop that's the kind of antagonist of the story and becomes sort of like the protagonist, and depending on your perspective, right? Because he orders the basilica to be built eventually, but he never mentions this story in his own writings, in his own personal memoirs. And you would think that if Zumárraga had thought that this was such a miraculous event with the tilma and the image appearing miraculously when Juan Diego supposedly releases his tilma and all the roses fall out and all this stuff, you would have mentioned somewhere.
You would think he would have written it down. He would have made a note. Oh yeah, and the Virgin Mary appeared to us, so that happened.
I was there. Yeah, you were there too, weren't you?
And you were there? But what's great about the stuff from Ixtlilxochitl is they try to use it as evidence, but he never once references like the appearance of La Virgen. He just mentions it in terms of, Cortés came in this way through Tepeyac, and that's where the basilica to La Virgen is. Yeah. In fact, what's one other one? He says, after Cortés arrived, the troops mentioned above, along with a rear guard and support from the ships, entered by the road and the walls of the city until they came to Tepeyac, where the chapel of Our Lady of Guadalupe is now. Like, that's not proof of the apparition. He's just mentioning, like, for point of fact, like, Cortés came in this way, and for point of reference, it's where this chapel stands, where the chapel stands today. But that's how weak their evidence was in this inquiry, right. And that's why the church was like, nah.
I mean, you would think that the church, having existed for, hundreds of years, a millennia and some at that point, would have some kind of standards of evidence that they would accept when determining whether something is a miracle or not. But I guess that's kind of loosey-goosey, right?
Well, and then plus it was all about the money, right? Like, who was going to get the money? The money kept going to Spain unless they could prove that this image actually happened in Mexico, then they could keep the money. So
so the bottom line, the argument that I'm hearing from you is that the Virgen de Guadalupe from Mexico was essentially concocted as a get-rich-quick scheme.
It was a multi-level marketing scam.
It worked.
It was the what's that shit that they set up that they sell? It's like a health shake, Herbalife. It was the Herbalife of its day.
The Guadalupe life.
Guadalupe life. Well, I want to close with a quote.
On. Before we close, we haven't even touched the big elephant in the room. Why this even matters to our podcast? Mm-hmm. Why this? Right? What is the connection between La Virgen and Tonantzin? Is there a connection?
No.
What can we say about why people within the tradición danzante, within the tradición mexica, why they keep insisting that when they go dance at the church and the basilica on the 12th, when they go to people's homes and, dance and offer prayers in honor of Mother Earth, that they're doing it not for the Virgin, not for the Catholic faith, that they're there to represent what the Virgin originally represented to the indigenous people before she was syncretized and hybridized into this modern Virgin that has indigenous roots because she appeared to an indigenous man. Apparently that lends it credence as being part of the broader indigenous story that we should still respect and not criticize. But there isn't any linkage. There's no connection besides the fact that, as you were saying, that the Virgen, that the Basilica and the story was concocted around a place where indigenous people already traditionally migrated to, that happened to be one of the many Tonantzins. And in fact, it wasn't even Tonantzin Coatlicue, it was a completely different Tonantzin. It was two, right? Chicomecoat and Sihuacoat. And so why this insistence among danzantes and among people in the tradición mexica that the Virgen de Guadalupe is equal to? They don't even make any distinction. There's no, a semblance of nuance is sometimes offered when you press someone about this, but more often than not, on the face of it, it's equal, right? And then you get these images, right? That beautiful images. Don't get me wrong; these very beautiful and elaborate artistic images where you have. In fact, I have one hanging here on my wall that was produced by one of the great Chicana artists, Yolanda Lopez, who just passed away not too long ago, right? She did one of the first ones back in the Chicano movement days, of where she takes the Coatlicue and dresses Coatlicue in the garb and in the cloak of the Virgen de Guadalupe. It's a beautiful image artistically, and the idea behind it, the idea of the syncretism, and you have people who argue, well, that's what it represents to us now. Okay, sure, but then you have these people. I'm referring to this certain subsect of people within our culture, within the tradición, who insist upon, right? They will insist that the Virgen de Guadalupe is exactly the same as Coatlicue, and that all they're doing when they're celebrating the 12th and they're celebrating the Virgen, they're actually doing it for Mother Earth. And I say no. I say they're not equal. They never have been equal. And you can't just, supplant one for the other one and pretend that they're both one and the same. That is my opinion. That is my argument. We can't do it here in this episode because we haven't done the legwork on that. But I think that it's something that we need to, think about more, because those two images and those two traditions have nothing in common. One is the supposed mother of Jesus Christ, the mother of the Christian God, the God brought over by the Europeans. And the other one, Coatlicue, is a completely different concept that has nothing to do with virginity.
Well, yeah, and it's also a total misinterpretation and, in my opinion, disrespect of the Mexica cosmovision. Because if you look at the motherhood deity figures, the teteoh, the female teteoh involved in creation, they were not virgins. These were very sexualized, very sexual teteoh. And this whole turning her into a virgin, that's fucked up. It's like this weird, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It's patriarchal, right? It's this weird insistence of she's the mother of everything, but she's a virgin. It's like, come on.
Right. Well, because they're following that Christian tradition of virginity being something that is highly prized. I don't know who it was now, but I read a paper a long time ago where they look into the whole notion of the European obsession with virgins and virginity, and why it's always a woman and it's always a young, fertile young lady, that's supposedly being offered up to the gods in some way, being thrown into a volcano, right? That's one of those tropes that comes up often with Europeans as they project their own ideas of virgins and what it means to indigenous people. And if you look at the traditions of indigenous people, it's actually the opposite. There was more evidence to suggest that the people who, and here I'm gonna crush some people's feelings, is that sacrifices that were conducted by our ancestors, okay, we're going to talk about that at some point. That seems to be still a very thorny issue among our people within the tradición. But most of the sacrifices that were conducted were of men, young men, not virgins, not women. It was of young, healthy warrior type men. Okay, because those represented the strength of the people, whether it was people that were being conquered or people that were that they had been victorious over in some kind of conflict, but it was usually a male-oriented sacrifice. And so this idea of it being a virgin and how virgins are going to be sacrificed, or how it's virgin is the mother of, that's all a European tradition. And so to sort of bring all of that into the cosmology and the cosmovision of indigenous peoples is to continue the colonization of our people, of our traditions, of our spirituality, of our philosophies.
Exactly. And it's something that I like to call comfort colonialism.
Ah, that's right. That's a good term.
Because, it's like, well, we're all into decolonizing stuff except for the stuff that makes us feel good. And La Virgen de Guadalupe makes people feel good. So they'll, pull off all of this mental gymnastics to justify maintaining it. So when they say like, well, yeah, it's La Virgen de Guadalupe, but to us it represents, Coatlicue. And I'm like, well, then why aren't you using a symbol of Coatlicue? Like, why don't you just do what you say you're doing instead of framing it all under the veneer of Catholicism? And I think it's because our people do not want to give up that Catholicism because it makes them comfortable, and they are comfortable with that level of colonialism. It's comfort colonialism.
To add to the comfort colonialism, if it's true that the celebration that's being conducted is not that of the quote-unquote Virgen, but of actually Tonantzin, then why not do it on a date that actually correlates with Tonantzin, Coatlicue, or Chicomecoatl, or Cihuacoatl, and not on the day of the Virgen de Guadalupe? Why is it always on that day?
Yeah, and it's because it's just what they learned, and it's what they're comfortable with, and it's what makes them happy. And honestly, it takes work, right? To find out, when was this ritual, when was the ceremony done, how was it carried out? It's easier to be like, well, we're just going to go pray to La Virgen de Guadalupe and pretend that it's Coatlicue.
There's a lot of pretending going around, apparently.
Yes, sir. Well, I want to end with a quote from Stafford Poole. This is from the Catholic Historical Review from 2014. And for people who don't know, Stafford Poole is a Catholic priest who is one of the most well-spoken and well-researched individuals when it comes to uncovering like the true history of La Virgen de Guadalupe, the mythology surrounding it, how she was invented, and why. But here's a quote from Stafford Poole. The story of the Virgin's appearance to Juan Diego and Juan Bernardino, his uncle, came only with the publication of Miguel Sanchez's Imagen de la Virgen María in 1648 and Luis Lasso de la Vega's Way Tlamahuilcoltica in the following year. Afterward, the strongest appeal of the devotion was to the criollos, or persons of European lineage born in the New World, rather than the natives. So I think that very succinctly wraps it up. Like, the whole story of this appearance, it was a criollo story invented by a criollo priest meant to inspire criollos and basically serve as a symbol of criollo nationalism. And that's something that, whether you believe in La Virgen de Guadalupe or not, I think you should know that this image that you're venerating is purely the result of a European plot.
Yikes. So I'm looking at the name of the book, right? It's you said Tlahuicoltica, but it's got the C cedilla on my end, the little squiggly line under the C. So isn't that supposed to be pronounced like a Z?
It doesn't have that on mine. Which C does it?
It's showing it on the image of the actual 1649 publication, and it's got the V instead of the U.
But where does the little squiggly?
Okay, Tlahuicoltica.
Okay,
so instead of Coltica, yeah, and it's translated as the great event. So I'm not sure if that's accurate or if this is also some made up now. What? Maybe we can get Magnus to tell us.
So there you go, dear listeners. The story of La Virgen de Guadalupe, from her origins in Extremadura, Spain, her veneration by Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortez, who brought her to Mexico, where she was used as a symbol of the New Jerusalem, reinvented by Miguel Sanchez as a symbol and story of Criollo nationalism, to her current incarnation as she exists in Mexico today. I know a lot of people might be upset by the content of these two episodes, but I assure you, no insult was meant. We only want to bring you the facts as they are. And remember, dear listeners, the truth, well, it's like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it's always good for you.
No virgins were harmed in the making of this episode.
Timoitase.
Hiya!
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase.